In the town of Belwick, they still whisper it, the hollow grave name. Not in the church pews, not on the streets, and certainly not in the presence of strangers. The name is spoken only in dark kitchens and over late-night bottles of whiskey, as if uttering it aloud might summon something best left buried. The Hollowgrave family has not lived in Belwick for over 180 years. Yet, their presence clings to the town like the damp fog rolling in from the marsh. No written records list their burial plots. No photographs survive. But those who claim to have seen the Hollowgrave estate in its final days describe it the same way. A looming three-story manor of rotting clapboard, its windows sealed from the inside with nailed planks, the front door carved with strange symbols no one in the county could read. The year was 1798. America was still young, a fragile nation finding its footing after the Revolution. Belwick itself was a speck on the map in the Northern Territories, built around the timber trade and the black iron ore that miners dragged from the hills. By candlelight, families read the Bible to ward off the superstitions that still clung from Europe's dark centuries. But in Belwick, faith had a rival, and that rival was the Hollowgrave family. According to the earliest surviving court documents, a weather-stained packet dated October 12, 1807, the Hollowgraves arrived in Belwick from the Massachusetts coast. There were 4 of them: Elias Hollowgrave, his wife Temperance, and their 2 sons, Ambrose and Silas. Town rumor claimed they came from a whaling community that had been swept clean by sickness, leaving only a handful of survivors. No one knew why they chose Belwick. No one asked they first. Elias was merely a wealthy landowner, an austere, pale man with sharp cheekbones and a voice that, by all accounts, could still a room like frost on a window. He purchased the old Wayford estate on the edge of the marsh, a property long considered cursed after 3 generations of its previous owners died prematurely. Elias paid in gold coin. Temperance Hollowgrave was something else entirely. She dressed in black silk even in summer, her hair bound so tightly it pulled the skin around her temples taut. More than one shopkeeper swore she never blinked during conversation. The children, Ambrose at 14, Silas at 12, were equally unsettling. Neighbors claimed they rarely saw the boys outdoors, except during heavy fog, when they would walk the marsh paths barefoot, whispering to one another in a language no one recognized. The Hollowgraves did not attend church. This was scandal enough in Belwick, but what truly ignited suspicion were the sounds that by night. Those who lived near the marsh reported music, not the fiddle and drum of local dances, but deep, droning notes like a funeral march slowed to a crawl. At times there were voices, layered and low, reciting in unison. One miner swore that on a windless night in August, he heard a woman singing in the Hollowgrave fields, the melody beautiful yet wrong, the kind of wrong that unsettles the bones. Still, there were no crimes, no accusations. Not yet. In the spring of 1799, strange gifts began to appear on the porches of Belwick's poorest families. A loaf of dark bread wrapped in wax cloth, a jar of preserved meat, a silver coin. No note, no explanation. People took them without question. Hunger makes for easy forgiveness. But within weeks, those same families began withdrawing from the community. Children stopped playing in the town square. Wives avoided the marketplace. And when anyone asked after them, the answer was always the same: "We've been called." No one knew what that meant. Not until the disappearances began. Between 1800 and 1802, 8 families vanished from Belwick without notice. Their homes were left locked from the inside. Tables set for meals never eaten, beds neatly made. No valuables were missing. No wagon tracks or footprints left behind. The sheriff at the time, Benjamin Rowe, wrote in his logbook, "It is as though they were lifted whole into the fog and carried away." Rumors swelled, but there was no proof. And Elias Hollowgrave? He became more visible, more generous, sponsoring road repairs, hiring half the town to work his marshlands, and paying them in coin far heavier than any American mint. His influence seeped into the veins of Belwick like slow poison. By 1803, the Hollowgrave Manor was no longer just a house. Locals began referring to it as the meeting place. Lights burned in its windows well past midnight. Wagonloads of supplies arrived from distant towns, crates stamped with symbols, heavy barrels that sloshed with something thicker than water. And always, the music that a single surviving diary from that period, kept by a farmer named Obadiah Crane, describes one night. In February, when the marsh was alight with torches, he wrote, "The air was full of that low chanting. It came from every direction, as if the land itself were speaking. I saw them walking, 2 by 2, hands joined, their faces covered with black veils. I could not move, could not speak. My wife pulled me inside and barred the door. When the chanting stopped, I swear the fog breathed in, as though it were alive." Something had taken root in Belwick, and though the townspeople whispered, no one dared challenge it. Those who did speak openly, a blacksmith named Tobias Hatch, a schoolmistress named Lydia Shaw, left town within days of their warnings, their homes abandoned. It wasn't until the night of June 17, 1806, that the first real confrontation occurred. The Hollowgrave estate had been quiet for nearly a month, its windows dark, the marsh silent. Then, without warning, bells began ringing from within the house. Not the small chime of a handbell, but great, resonant tolls, each one rolling through the night air like thunder underwater. Men from town gathered with lanterns and muskets, intending to confront Elias. But when they reached the manor, the doors were wide open, the great hall empty, and a single trail of wet footprints leading deeper inside. Sheriff rose final. Note from that night reads, "The house swallowed the light. We searched room to room, but the air was wrong, thick, as though underwater. In the dining hall, the long table was set for 30. Plates of raw meat, still steaming. Not a soul in sight. By morning, 3 of the men who had entered the house were missing, and for the first time, the people of Belwick began to believe that whatever the Hollowgraves were, they were not entirely human. No official birth record exists for Elias Hollowgrave, but fragments from shipping manifests and tax ledgers place a man of his name on the Massachusetts coast as early as 1771. He is listed not as a sailor or merchant, but as an independent patron of a small whaling fleet in Ipswich Harbor. A curious distinction in an era when such enterprises were family-owned. That a surviving letter from that period, written by a ship's quartermaster named Ezra Pike, describes Elias in unsettling terms. He came to the docks at night, never by day. His eyes were gray like clouded glass, and when he looked at you, it was as if your thoughts were not your own. He would speak low to the captain, and by morning, the men would follow his word without question. It was also in Ipswich where whispers began of secret gatherings in the cellars of old sea captains' houses, of strange tokens cast into the harbor, and of widows visited at night by pale, soft-spoken strangers promising that the sea could give back what it had taken, temperance. Hollowgrave's past is even more elusive. The only known mention before Belwick comes from a Salem court ledger in 1789, where a temperance holt was fined for conduct unbecoming a woman after attempting to hold a burial service without a clergyman. She paid the fine in full, but according to the clerk's margin note, she left the courtroom smiling at the magistrate in a manner most unholy. The two appear in Belwick together in the winter of 1798, with their sons Ambrose and Silas in tow, boys whose pale complexions and unblinking gazes sparked gossip that they were either sickly or touched by some strange gift at a tea first. The Hollowgraves kept their circle small. They hired locals to work their marshlands, but spoke little, paid in coin no one could place, and remained absent from church and market. But this aloofness did not last. In the spring of 1799, Elias began inviting select townspeople to the manor, tradesmen, widows, and a handful of influential farmers. The invitations were hand-delivered by Ambrose or Silas, folded in thick black paper and sealed with a symbol, a downward-pointing crescent flanked by 2 dots. The gatherings were said to be feasts, though no one ever spoke of the food. One of the earliest first-hand accounts comes from a woman named Mercy Colburn, who was 17 at the time. Her diary, preserved in the Belwick Historical Society, recounts her visit in careful, almost reverent detail. The hall smelled of rosemary and something sweeter, like molasses left too long in the heat. We sat at a long table, the chairs high and straight. Elias spoke only a little, his voice like warm rain. Temperance poured the drink. a red darker than wine. It was here that the townsfolk began to notice a change. These people no longer greeted their neighbors. They walked the streets in pairs, their steps perfectly in sync, their eyes fixed on the ground. Sheriff Rose logs from 1801 mention the Watchers, townspeople who would stand at the edge of the marsh at dusk, facing the manor in total stillness, as though awaiting some signal. If spoken to, they would not answer. If touched, they would recoil violently. On October 4th, 1802, a fisherman named Daniel Pruitt reported finding a crude altar deep in the reeds. It was made of stone too heavy to have been dragged there without several men, its surface carved, with the same crescent and dots symbol from the hollow grave invitations. At its base lay the remains of several birds and a small deer, their bodies arranged in spirals. Pruitt destroyed the altar with his axe, but within 2 days, he was gone. His skiff was found drifting in the river, its oars missing, the seat spattered with something dark. The hollow graves themselves never appeared hostile. Elias was seen tipping his hat to strangers, Temperance visiting the homes of the sick, the boys quietly assisting workers in the fields. But there was something deliberate about their kindness, a precision in how it was given, and to whom. In early 1804, a series of ensigned pamphlets appeared on doorsteps across Belwick. They were written in elegant script, and their message was simple yet unnerving. There is a place for you. The hollow grave, keep the old ways. We do not wither. We do not starve. The land will claim you or save you. Choose. Some burned the pamphlets. Others hid them. But a few, too many, followed their words straight into the marsh. The number of disappearances rose sharply in 1805. And with each one, the manor grew more active. Lantern light flickered behind boarded windows. Smoke curled from its chimneys, night and day, carrying the sharp scent of herbs unknown to the local fields. And the music returned, always the same deep, droning hum, as though an organ played somewhere just beneath the floorboards. One particularly chilling account comes from Jonah Brewer, a carpenter hired to repair a section of the hollow graves. Roof that spring. In a statement given years later, Brewer recalled, I worked the better part of 2 days without seeing anyone but the younger boy, Silas. He never spoke, only watched. On the second night, I heard voices below me, not speaking, but murmuring together, rising and falling like the tide. I found a crack between the boards and looked down into the main hall. There were 20, maybe more, all in dark veils, holding hands in a circle. In the center stood Elias, and beside him, Temperance. They were looking at something on the floor. I couldn't see it clear, but I knew, whatever it was alive. Brewer left the job unfinished. He left Belwick soon after. Why now? Fear was thick in the town's air, but fear alone did not stop the hollow graves. In fact, it seemed to feed them. Families who resisted began to speak of strange dreams, dreams of standing in water up to their waists, of voices calling from the fog, of pale hands reaching from beneath the surface. These dreams were so vivid that some awoke with their feet wet, the floorboards beneath their beds swollen as if from rain. Then, on the night of December 12th, 1805, the bells rang again. Not for minutes this time, but for hours, a slow, rhythmic toll that rolled through the marsh and into every home in Belwick. No one went to the manor that night. The next morning, 2 more houses stood empty. The town's minister, Reverend Alcott, urged the sheriff to act, but Rowe refused. In his final surviving log entry from that year, he wrote only, "The hollow graves are older than us, older than Belwick. I believe they will be here long after we are gone." Asterisk by the spring of 1806, the hollow grave name was no longer just a whisper in Belwick. It was an unspoken fact, a force that hung in the air, pressing down on the townspeople like the humid fog rolling off the marsh. The disappearances were too many now to dismiss as chance or choice. In a village of fewer than 600 souls, 29 were gone in less than a decade, most without warning, some vanishing alongside their entire households. The pattern was impossible to ignore, though those who dared speak of it rarely stayed in Belwick long. It was around this time that the first surviving outsider account appears, a letter from a traveling tinsmith named Oliver Rains to his brother in Hartford, dated April 2nd, 1806. The letter, preserved in the Hartford Historical Archives, reads in part, "The folk here are strange. They tell me not to work near the marsh after dusk, and one woman near spat at me when I asked why. I see them at night, walking in pairs toward a great house on the far edge of the water. No lamps, no words, only the sound of their feet in the wet earth. The house itself glows from within, though its windows are boarded. And the air, God help me, the air near it tastes like copper. That copper taste was noted by others as well. Farmers working the low field swore they could smell blood when the wind shifted toward them from the hollow grave estate. Sheriff Rowe, reluctant for years to act against the family, finally agreed to lead a small search of the manor's grounds. In May 1806, prompted by the disappearance of Lydia Shaw's 2 children, witnesses claim he was pale and unsteady as he gathered a group of 8 armed men. What happened that night was pieced together from conflicting testimonies, but the central facts remain. The men crossed the causeway at twilight, finding the manor's front doors shut but unlocked. Inside, the air was heavy and damp, their breath hanging in the stillness. No hollow graves were seen, yet the building was far from empty. One man, Isaac Morrell, described finding a side room lined with glass jars. Inside each jar floated something unrecognizable, pale and knotted like roots torn from the ground, though a few bore shapes disturbingly close to human features. Morrell claimed he saw what looked like an infant's hand pressed against the inside of the glass. Another, Thomas Greaves, told his wife that in the main hall there was a long dining table, set for a feast, but every plate held only water. The men stood around it in confusion until one of them touched a cup. The water inside rippled, as if something beneath the surface had moved. The official report Sheriff Rowe filed the following morning stated only that the manor was vacant and of no immediate threat. But according to Morrell's daughter, he returned home that night shaking and unable to speak for hours. 3 days later, Thomas Greaves was gone. From that point forward, the hollow graves became bolder. The tolling bells returned, often sounding in the dead of night, each slow chime echoing across the marsh. The watchers, those veiled figures who stood at the water's edge, increased in number. It was no longer just the poor or the desperate. Merchants, blacksmiths, and even a midwife were seen among them, standing motionless for hours as if under a spell. Newspaper clippings from towns as far as Providence mentioned Belwick now, brief, uneasy reports of a sect of unnatural persuasion, drawing people from surrounding settlements. These clippings often refer to a series of midnight processions and unnerving sounds unlike any church service of Christian design. One clipping from the New England Chronicle dated July 18, 1806 reads, "The marshes of Belwick play, host to a gathering of most peculiar custom, wherein the attendees do not sing hymns, but utter drawn and tuneless sounds, as though calling to something unseen. Several who have attended are thereafter absent from the following day's census, their homes locked and their animals unfed." It was this growing notoriety that drew the attention of Reverend Samuel Alcott of nearby Northam. A man of rigid Calvinist conviction, Alcott saw the hollow graves as a corruption of God's law and traveled to Belwick that August with the intention of confronting Elias directly. According to the Reverend's surviving journal, he was met at the door not by Elias, but by Temperance. She stood in the doorway, black silk gloves covering her hands despite the summer heat. Alcott writes, "Her eyes were not cruel, but they were without mercy. She did not bar my entry. Instead, she stepped aside, and I entered into a darkness that was not of the absence of light. The walls seemed to close behind me. I asked after her husband, but she told me he was among the water. I inquired further, but she only smiled, and asked if I had come to hear the call. I felt a pull then, as though her voice was not sound but a current. I fled before I saw the others. But even as I ran, I heard them following, bare feet on the floorboards, keeping pace with my steps." Alcott's visit marked the beginning of open defiance. Small groups of townspeople began carrying firearms. When passing near the marsh, farmers refused hollow grave coin. The minister in Belwick preached sermons against those who feed upon the soul as the leech upon blood. But with defiance came consequences. On September 9, 1806, a storm rose suddenly over Belwick, the kind locals said belonged to the ocean, not the marsh. Winds lashed the town, rain flooding the streets in minutes. By morning, 3 houses on the marsh's edge were gone, their timbers swept into the reeds. By October, Belwick was a town divided. Those who believed the hollow graves were an ancient evil to be rooted out, and those who claimed they were the town's protectors against something far worse that dwelled in the marsh that lay in the middle. Of that division, another disappearance struck, this one impossible to ignore. Sheriff Benjamin Rowe, the very man who had shielded the hollow graves for years, was found dead in his home. Or rather, what was left of him was found, seated upright at his table, his eyes missing, his face fixed in a faint, unsettling smile, pinned. To his chest was a folded scrap of paper bearing a single line in perfect script. "The land will claim you or save you. Choose." The townspeople had their first death tied, at least in their own minds, directly to the hollow graves. And with it, they had their first taste of vengeance. What happened next would become the most infamous night in Belwick's history, the night they stormed the hollow grave estate. The winter of 1891 was the coldest Hollowmere had endured in decades. The Blackstone estate sat beneath a shroud of ice, its Gothic spires dusted with snow that seemed to absorb the weak light of the sun rather than reflect it. The villagers trudged through frost-hardened paths, their eyes lowered whenever they passed the wrought-iron gates of Blackstone Manor. By now, the tales about the family had traveled far beyond Hollowmere's borders, whispered in taverns, carried in letters, even muttered in the pews of churches miles away. The rumors painted a picture far worse than simple greed or eccentricity. Some said the Blackstones trafficked in relics not meant for human hands, artifacts stolen from crypts, chalices from plague pits, and books bound in the skin of the damned. Others claimed that in the manor's hidden catacombs, the family convened, not for prayer, but for rituals that drew things out of the dark. And though such accusations sounded like drunken folklore, the one undeniable truth was this: everyone who had crossed the Blackstones in recent years had vanished. Among the missing was Reverend Samuel Gray, the only clergyman in Hollowmere bold enough to openly challenge the family. In his final sermon, delivered the Sunday before he disappeared, Reverend Gray had spoken of a wicked lineage that festers at the heart of our village and warned that God's patience would not last forever. His words had stirred the congregation into uneasy silence, and by the following morning, his rectory was empty. The villagers claimed they heard footsteps on the frozen roads that night, multiple sets, dragging something heavy toward the manor. But when the sheriff searched the estate, the Blackstones greeted him warmly, their matriarch Helena even offering him tea in the drawing room. No trace of the Reverend was ever found. Inside the manor, life moved according to its own rhythm. The grand halls were lined with oil portraits of Blackstones from generations past, each face rendered in painstaking detail, their eyes following you no matter where you stood. The current patriarch, Elias Blackstone, had taken to hosting late-night gatherings in the ballroom. The music was strange, haunting compositions that seemed more dirge than dance, and the guests stranger still. Some were local gentry, others foreigners whose pale complexions and glassy eyes gave the impression they had not seen the sun in years. No coach was ever seen arriving, yet the ballroom would be full by midnight. It was during one such winter gathering that young Thomas Weller, a stable boy working in the village, decided to spy on the proceedings. He had heard his father speak of the Blackstones in hushed tones and had always been curious about the manor. That night, hidden beneath the hedges near the eastern wall, Thomas saw something that would haunt him until the day he died. Through a frost-laced window, he glimpsed the ballroom, not lit by chandeliers, but by an unnatural glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. The guests formed a ring around a marble dais, and at the center, Elias Blackstone stood over a stone basin filled with something thick and red. His hands were coated in it, and as he lifted them to the light, the entire room erupted into a low, guttural chant. Thomas ran before he could see more, slipping on the frozen earth and cutting his palms open. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of the village, and even then, he refused to speak of what he'd witnessed for nearly 20 years. When he finally told the story on his deathbed, his wife swore his voice cracked like a man choking on his own breath. The following spring, the whispers demanded a life, a sacrifice to keep the Blackstone fortune intact. Failure to comply meant ruin, swift, cruel, and absolute. She had thought about running, She had even packed a bag once. But every time she stepped beyond the iron gates, her vision would blur. The road would twist into impossible shapes, and she'd find herself back at the front door, suitcase in hand. "You can't keep them waiting forever," Elias said, drifting toward the window. His form shimmered, half there, half elsewhere. "They've already taken the others." Miriam's throat tightened. The others, her cousins, her uncles, her father, each gone in inexplicable ways. Some vanished in the night, others were found, twisted and contorted as if every bone in their bodies had been broken from the inside. "What if I refuse?" she whispered. Elias turned to her then, his mouth curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Then you'll see what happens when the foundation hungers." The lamp sputtered and went out, plunging the parlor into blackness. For a moment, there was only the sound of the storm. Then, faintly at first but growing louder, came the sound of wet, dragging footsteps. They were moving up from the basement. Miriam rose from the piano bench, her heart hammering. She backed toward the doorway, her hands fumbling for the wall. The footsteps were joined by a low, gurgling sound, like something drowning and breathing at the same time. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the hallway. She saw them, 3 shadowed forms, crawling up the grand staircase. Their limbs were too long, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their eyes shone like mirrors catching firelight. The air grew thick and heavy. Miriam could feel her own blood pounding in her ears. She turned and ran, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. Behind her, the things picked up speed, their wet hands smearing the walls as they pursued her. She burst into the kitchen, slamming the heavy oak door behind her and throwing the latch. She pressed her back against it, panting. For a moment, silence. Then, the door shook violently, the hinges creaking, the wood splintering under inhuman force. Her gaze darted to the far end of the kitchen, where the entrance to the cellar gaped open like a mouth. She could see the narrow staircase descending into darkness, where the foundation stone waited. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a dozen voices speaking in unison. Miriam. She didn't remember deciding to move. Her feet carried her forward, down the steps, deeper into the earth. The air grew damp, and the walls dripped with condensation. The smell of rot and stone filled her nostrils. At the bottom of the stairs, the foundation stone stood in the center of the room, lit by no visible source. It pulsed faintly, as if alive. The carvings writhed when she looked at them too long, shifting like worms beneath the surface. "They want someone," Elias's voice echoed in her mind. "It doesn't have to be you." Her hands curled into fists. She thought of the villagers outside the gates, how they whispered about the Blackstones, how they looked at her with fear and suspicion. She thought of Jonathan, the groundskeeper, who had been sneaking food from the pantry. She thought of the letter from her banker, warning that the family's assets were beginning to dissolve. The foundation stone throbbed once, hard, like a heartbeat. Miriam's lips parted. "I'll do it." A cold wind swept through the cellar, carrying with it a sound that was half sigh, half laughter. The carvings flared, their light painting the walls in grotesque shapes. Above her, the kitchen door finally splintered. The creatures poured in, their dragging limbs echoing in the stairwell. But they didn't attack her. They circled the stone. Instead, their heads bowed. Miriam felt the pact settle around her shoulders like a cloak. Heavy, suffocating, but powerful. Her family's fortune would endure. The whispers quieted, replaced by a single thought that was not her own. Bring them. When she finally emerged from the basement, the storm had passed. The house stood silent, the moonlight casting long shadows through the broken kitchen door. Miriam crossed the threshold without fear. Somewhere beyond the gates, the village slept, unaware that the Blackstone line had been renewed, and that before the week was over, someone among them would vanish, never to be seen again. The foundation would feast, and Miriam Blackstone would see to it personally. The storm outside had begun to swell into a frenzy, rattling the warped shutters of the Blackstone manor. The walls themselves seemed to hum with a low vibration, as though the house was not merely enduring the weather, but feeding on it. Daniel gripped the lantern tighter, its flame dancing wildly, casting grotesque shapes along the cracked plaster walls. Somewhere above him, a sound reverberated, A slow, deliberate dragging of something heavy across the floor. He forced himself up the grand staircase, his boots sinking into the threadbare carpet that released little clouds of dust with every step. The portraits on the walls seemed to shift in the flickering light, their eyes glistening, following him with unnerving precision. He reached the landing and paused, the air so heavy it was as though he'd climbed into the belly of the earth. Rather than simply up a set of stairs, the sound came again, closer now, from the east wing. That part of the house had been sealed off for decades after the incident in 1893. No one in town agreed on what the incident had been. Some claimed it was a fire, others a murder, but everyone agreed on one thing. No one went into the east wing and returned unchanged as he stepped forward, his fingers trailing along the cold, damp wallpaper until they found the doorframe. The wood was swollen from years of neglect. He shoved against it, and the door groaned open with a sound that made the hair on his arms rise. Inside, the air was rank and warm, carrying the scent of rotting wood and something older, almost metallic. His lantern's light revealed the source of the dragging, a long, blackened coffin resting diagonally on the floor, one end tipped up on a broken chair. The heavy lid was slightly ajar, leaving a gap of shadow. Daniel swallowed hard. The dragging resumed, but it wasn't the coffin moving. From the far corner of the room, a figure was pulling itself forward on all fours. Its head hung low, hair slicked across its face like wet seaweed. The hands were pale, stretched too long, the fingers tipped in blackened nails that it stopped moving when Daniel's light fell on it. Slowly, impossibly slow, it lifted its head. It wasn't a face. Where eyes should have been were dark, concave hollows. Where a mouth should have been was a jagged slit, stitched crudely shut with wire. And yet, even without a mouth, it spoke, not aloud, in his head. "You brought the light. Good, now we can see." The sound was not a single voice, but a chorus of whispers, all layered over each other in a nauseating harmony. Daniel's knees buckled. He wanted to run, but his legs felt submerged in tar. The figure began to crawl faster, the joints cracking unnaturally with each movement. As it reached him, the lantern sputtered and went out. The darkness was complete. In that blackness, hands gripped his arms, his throat, his face. A cold rush of breath, not from lungs, but from some hollow place, washed over him. His mind fractured with images. The Blackstone children sitting silently in a circle, the matriarch holding a silver basin full of blood, the patriarch carving runes into the very walls of the house while chanting in a language that was not human. Then, silence. When Daniel awoke, he was lying in the front hall of the manor, the storm outside now quiet. His lantern was beside him, its glass shattered. The sun was just beginning to rise. For a moment, he wondered if it had all been some fevered nightmare. But then he noticed the fresh scratches on the wooden floor leading from the front hall toward the east wing. Deep gouges, as though something had been dragged, something heavy. And when he stepped outside into the pale morning light, he saw it. Every window of the manor, every single one, had someone standing behind it, watching him. But there had only been one figure in the east wing. Or so he thought.